Scarlet Kim. I'm a legal officer at Privacy International. I'm thrilled to welcome Graham Webster with us today as part of our speaker series. Graham is a senior fellow with the Tsai China Center at Yale Law School, where he's also affiliated with the Information Society Project. And Graham's also a China Digital Economy Fellow at New America, serving as coordinating editor of the DigiChina project, which translates and analyzes Chinese commentary and primary sources on digital policy. Graham, you wear multiple hats, so I thought it might be helpful if you could start us off by telling us a little bit more about yourself, your work on China, and some of your current areas of research.
Right, so thanks. First, thank you for having me here. It's really exciting to join all of you at Privacy International and to talk about these issues. My story is a little bit of a long arc. About 10 years ago, I was writing about China and the internet as a sort of lowly blogger journalist in Beijing. Went off to grad school and got into studying pretty much everything I could find in terms of how the internet and society and politics interact in China. And then I went on this grand detour through US-China relations where I was focusing on pretty much every issue that those two governments get themselves into. And just over the last couple of years, I've refocused on what I'm thinking of as digital technologies in China. So it's not just the internet. It's everything from new artificial intelligence or new applications for a variety of technologies, and all the way into one day I hope to understand what's going on with genetic sequencing and these types of digital technologies. So I come from that direction to now living in Oakland, California, where I work on these under these two hats. For Yale, most of what I do is helping to organize engagements, US-China engagements on digital policy, specifically some AI and cyberspace governance issues. And with New America, as Scarlet mentioned, I'm coordinating a really amazing group of people across a lot of organizations to translate and analyze what's coming out of China's government and thinking community on digital issues. So it's a lot of things all at once right now.
So I know you've done quite a bit of work mapping the Chinese digital policy landscape, and we don't have enough time today to cover it comprehensively, but I thought it might be helpful if you could sketch out some of the characteristics of the Chinese government's posture towards digital policy, just focusing on some high-level points.
So the big story over the long term is that China came to the internet a little later than a lot of other countries. In about 1997, 98, you went from having almost nobody on the internet to having a sort of geometric increase in the number of internet users. And you're up to something in the range of 750 million internet users in China now. But on a baseline of about 1.4 billion, it's still just over 50% of people who are online. So just as a baseline, it's important to think about we're still talking about a situation where this large country that accounts for 1/5 of the human population today is still half not connected. So I like to include that in there. But since the late 90s, and especially in the 2000s, there was an explosion of development of the internet in society, in commerce. There was a never-before-seen enlargement of the public sphere in China. There'd never been anything quite like an open, publishing space where thoughts and letters could be passed around so freely, and that saw what we all have heard about, the Great Firewall and all of the censorship efforts that have emerged to try to control that on the part of the Chinese government. Coming into this decade, with Xi Jinping's coming to power, there have been a number of transitions, and one has been a bureaucratic innovation to develop new cyberspace policy authorities, specifically the Cyberspace Administration of China. And our DigiChina team has come up with way that I won't go through completely to think about 6 interlocking areas of policy that are operating in the Chinese system to manage the internet and to sort of harness it for social priorities and for priorities of the Communist Party. We're familiar with the censorship and propaganda and content management and sort of real name requirements so that statements can be identified to individuals. There are a number of sort of hard cybersecurity concerns, like figuring out ways to certify or rate the level of security of different products and services that might be used. For our discussion today, one of the most important areas is that there's been an emerging focus on what's called personal information or important data, and protecting these 2 types of data. But this is an emerging regime of regulation that surrounds the cybersecurity law that went into effect last June. And the fact is, we still don't know what these basic concepts, important data and personal information, mean in a highly concrete way in the Chinese system. But there is an effort to build in data protection, both for national security purposes. The Chinese government doesn't want outsiders coming in and grabbing huge amounts of data to exploit in some way. Also for domestic sort of cybercrime issues, you don't want big data sets going to criminals who are going to rip off the public. And then there's also elements of, I think there's an honest concern about privacy to some extent, and also, of course, the control aspects that come into it. So the last thing I'll say is that alongside these sort of administrative controls and administrative regimes, since the 90s, there's been a big decision on the part of the government to push technology-driven development. And this means moving up the value chain, trying to avoid the middle income trap. It means promoting digital technologies and internet adoption as a way to equalize inequality between the coast and the typically much poorer western areas of the country. And it also means things today, like we hear a lot about these grand plans to develop artificial intelligence technology that would be, really world leading. And you get a lot of big plans, and then you get to see what actually happens. But there's, a big priority put on development.
So at PI, we work on both state and corporate surveillance. And I think that China is often portrayed by those who look at privacy and technology issues in the West as a kind of dystopian future in both contexts. And I think we'd be curious to know how true you think that type of portrayal is.
So I think the dystopian future question, it does 2 dirty tricks. One is it assumes that the rest of the world is moving in an authoritarian direction. And the second is that it assumes that the reality in China today is indicative of where the rest of the world might be going. I think both of these are sort of speculative and not very analytically useful, but there are surveillance technologies being developed by Chinese vendors and installed with none of the sort of liberal democratic due process protections that I might be used to in the United States. We have our problems, but there are big limits, and there's a lot of accountability that can be brought by society. And so you have local security authorities installing facial recognition technology in a way that isn't necessarily highly supervised. Other types of surveillance technology can be experimented on, especially in the northwestern Xinjiang province, where there's a major repression of Uyghur Muslims. There's been violence of various kinds, both perpetrated by the state and by groups resisting the state. The level of control and technologized control that's being tried out there likely will inform the way that other authoritarian activities will take place outside in the rest of the world. So, you know, as for whether we're all heading down that road, I mean, we're here in London. It's famous for a CCTV system that is, you know, considered highly intrusive. You know, does it mean that all of a sudden the UK is going to adopt the same tactics that Chinese authorities are adopting? I don't think necessarily, but it's worth paying attention to.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the trend that you note in China, I mean, not the trend, the reality that there's a lack of what you describe as due process controls, I think that's actually a characteristic that's also true in liberal democratic societies when it comes to the deployment of new types of surveillance technology. So in that sense, it's not so much an other, it's just a trait that's kind of shared across a lot of different societies. One example of the dystopian future, setting aside the fact that it might not be that analytically useful a concept, but one example that's cited to again and again by those in the West is the social credit system. And I was wondering if you could explain briefly what it is, its current posture, and I think we're really curious to know whether the coverage outside of China about it is accurate.
Thanks. So the social credit system is a major topic of interest in the media. It's eye-catching, it's vague, and it's not been fully developed yet, to say the least. So a couple of main things that we can say about it. For one thing, the social credit system is not a single system. And here I'm drawing on work by my Yale colleague, Jeremy Dahm, and my New America colleague, Rohir Kramers, where there has been a declared intention on the part of the central government to build a social credit system that would act to enforce norms of trustworthiness and dependability on individuals and companies and government agencies by sort of marking consequences for actions of various kinds. And there has been another set of activities, most famously from the Alibaba affiliate Sesame Credit, where a private company, or several others have tried this, but Sesame is the most prominent, a private company will try to build a credit system that's devoted to estimating creditworthiness in a very classic sense. Should I loan this person money? And they're both called social credit. So this helps not at all. But they're separate though, and it's important to keep that separation in mind because the stuff that goes on in Sesame Credit is the most interesting from the perspective of exploiting personal data and large data sets. This is where Alipay, the unit of the Alibaba empire that operates Sesame, they're a major payment platform in China. They're one of the essentially two primary ways that you're going to pay for things these days, and probably outranking cash, especially. So it's Alipay and Tencent's WeChat Pay. So they have transaction data, and they know who's buying what from whom, and what types of things they're doing, and where they're doing it, and what times they're doing it. And this type of data is very potentially intrusive. And if you apply algorithms, we don't know exactly what they use, to that data, you can start to draw inferences. And then they've done some other things, like they'll include certain things about your behavior with certain merchants or part of the social graph. And all of this feeds into the private Sesame Credit credit score. But that's the sort of creepy sounding stuff. That's not the state system. The state system, which is very nascent at this point, operates primarily on the basis of blacklists that are developed because people have failed to perform on a court judgment, or if they've been found to have violated rules in a particular context, and then they're barred essentially by law from certain privileges or activities because of that conduct. The big question is, will these two types of activities, the data-driven one and the sort of really old-fashioned government records type one, will they merge? And the answer is totally unknown right now.
I think there's a strong assumption in the West which kind of feeds into this dystopian vision of China that Chinese people have different views about privacy. In other words, that they might care less about privacy. I think we'd be curious to know whether you think that's true.
So I think this is a really tough question because my instinct is to say, that's sort of ridiculous ethnocentric reasoning, to think that there's an analogy to the notion of face, and often in Western circles, people will talk about this particular, East Asian propensity to care about losing face. And I always say, oh yes, in the United States, we all love to be publicly humiliated. This is just fantastic. And nobody enjoys a little bit of flattery at all. Okay, so I mean, sometimes there's a language put to things that gives it this mystical artifact that is not really a difference, even if it's a difference of rhetoric or of ways of talking about things. When it comes to privacy, I think that there are cultural factors that play into things, and then there are sort of lived environment factors. So there are different philosophical bases to think about individualism versus collective identities. How would you think about privacy there? But the way that I like to think about it is, what do we actually hear from Chinese people online or in person who are talking about the way they interact with online services or their privacy in the digital world, which is my focus. And we hear concerns that are not really all that unfamiliar. We hear about, there have been major controversies over the last sort of 6 or 9 months. Some over the question of, does Tencent, the parent company of the massive chat and everything else platform WeChat, do they have the ability to look at our messages? Well, people get really angry when it's implied that these executives can look at it. There's been a major controversy over whether, over an instance where Sesame Credit, we were just talking about, had included some new product, had the box already checked that if you sort of installed this product, you would automatically be enrolled in Sesame Credit. This got some users angry, and it drew a pretty stern response from the Chinese government. People wanted to have consent for how their data was collected. There was an interesting one about a sort of Internet of Things as a broad category, but specifically a surveillance camera product that by default would webcast the feed to an unlocked web platform. And some bloggers essentially said, this isn't probably a good idea. Would you really, there was a sort of joking blog post saying, if you have this in some restaurant, somebody's going to get caught with his mistress going out on an extra date. We don't presume to lose privacy simply for walking into this restaurant. So all of this sounds to me pretty familiar. And just to go back to what the internet did really in the early days in China was to open a public sphere in a way that had not been experienced before. I'm not an expert in this area, but I did do some research in grad school, and one of the things that I found really interesting is that the notion of the public sphere was much harder to square for the various historians and others who I read, whereas the notion of a private sphere and a sphere of the state was very well established in Chinese writing and thinking over centuries. So, I think that, sometimes, there's a difference of talking about it, there's a difference of rhetoric, but I would not go as far as to say that Chinese people don't care about privacy as much.
So what about the government? Because you mentioned that, over the past 9 months, there's been various sort of public outcry and a bit of a public discourse about particular, for example, data breaches. Does the government seem attuned to these types of public concerns?
So I think parts of the government, yes, are concerned with this. And as is often the case in the Chinese system, and in any government, different bureaucracies will be concerned with different things. We have good signs in that the cybersecurity law that I mentioned, which is the sort of a centerpiece of a broader regime of regulations and standards, does specifically call out personal information as something to be protected. There have been further regulations that go into specifying how that would be, and there was a standard or specification published that went into effect this month that sort of gives very detailed, prototypical practices, best practices for how to comply with the cybersecurity law and obtain consent for the various things that consent is required for. This standard is very obviously, and we know from speaking with some of the drafters of it, designed to be interoperable to some extent with the GDPR and other global frameworks. So there's an effort there not only to take this issue on, but to do it in a way that is not a Chinese-only solution. Now, that's not necessarily because everybody wants to protect privacy. If these regimes are interoperable, it's more likely that Chinese businesses are going to have an easier time. Now, I wouldn't imagine it's going to be easy, but it might be easier if the home system is closer to, say, the European system or the APEX system, rather than just being on its own planet. So interoperability has a sort of money value and a development value as well. The last thing I'll say is that standard is not officially binding, but it has been used in enforcement operations. When, as I mentioned, there was an instance where consent was not properly achieved according to the standard, some authorities went after this company and said, you didn't follow the standard. Now, I mean, that is kind of crazy because the standard's not binding and it wasn't even in effect yet. But still it was used as a cudgel by some authorities to sort of chase in these companies. The last thing I'll say is that we don't know the status. Somewhere in the future, we know that scholars are working on another round. There was a draft personal information protection law 10 years ago that did not get through the process in the National People's Congress to become a law. Now a group of people are working on doing another scholars draft, which then goes into drafting and debating, and people think it's a rubber stamp. There's actually a lot of process that goes on in developing one of these big Chinese regulatory pieces, and that's on the agenda as well for personal information protection. The big caveat to all that is the written law and the practices of companies and the government are often at odds. And even where we have sort of pretty good sounding protections for user data, universally in the Chinese case, as I know in many other countries, there's a national security exception that you could drive the entire internet through. So,
Sounds familiar.
It's on the list of priorities.
Okay. So one emerging area of work for us in our data exploitation program is artificial intelligence and its implications for privacy in particular. And a topic that seems to dominate discussions about AI is a supposed race for AI, with a primary focus on the US and China as the major players. One of your areas of expertise, as you described, is US-China relations, and you've also been looking more closely at the issue of AI through this lens. And we're wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what's really meant by a race for AI sort of in the popular discourse, and if you subscribe to the idea of a race at all.
So this is a really fun one, and that I personally have, this is what I consider fun. But so what would it mean to have a race for AI dominance or for AI leadership? The sort of military strategic people like the word dominance. I don't know what it means. I probably need to go study some military doctrine history, and I'll have more understanding of that. But the fundamental thing is that it's a state versus state question. And there, I think that there's some reason to say there's an AI race between the US and China, because there are competing militaries, there are potential areas of conflict. There could, the classic things are there could be a contingency around Taiwan, or something could go wrong in the South China Sea, or something could go wrong with the Korean Peninsula, which who knows what will happen there in the next few hours. So when it comes to military applications of AI, of course there's a race. They want to be able to, both sides want to make sure that the other military doesn't get all of a sudden this ability to just cancel all of the deterrence balance and all and to essentially upset the strategic balance. And that's, it would be good from a peace-loving perspective if the balance remains stable in the eyes of these military establishments. Now, on the other hand, that's not the same thing as a sort of race to master the self-driving car, right? Here, it's not the US versus China. It's 20 companies that are really seriously trying this right now, and maybe other entrants will come in and they'll master the technology. So you have to break down by what the application is, but then it gets even more fun. You have to break down by what the underlying technology is. Some innovations that could fuel a real advantage in autonomous driving could have dual use advantages in military applications, because autonomous systems in general are useful if you're trying to build a swarm of drones that are going to defeat your adversary in some way. So, I mean, the sort of moral of the story is, for me, it has to be broken down thing by thing. There are definitely US-China AI races. There are definitely races between Baidu and Google or Alphabet or whoever they are, and there are races within US companies, and there are races that I think some Israeli companies are reputed to be leading in certain areas, and Russians are certainly in the picture for military issues. But then if you slip into this third layer, there's some applications where it's just not a race. If Alibaba or Tencent really dominates the Chinese market with financial technology and the sort of, the loan making or the payments or the sort of marketing capabilities that they're able to offer, this isn't a race with another country. This is just a race between a couple of companies for market dominance in their country. And unless something fundamental changes about those companies, I don't see them going out and competing with the commercial infrastructure of a lot of other companies or countries. I could be wrong in that, and that's something to be seen. But so the answer is many AI races, not all of them country versus country. And I don't know how to describe the rest of it.
That was a good breakdown. Thank you. So as part of our work on AI, we're also interested in emerging laws and policies to regulate its use, particularly with respect to applications and use cases. As you said, when we look at AI technologies, we need to break it down to that sort of level, and that's something that we're interested in. And we'd like to focus in particular on applications and use cases that have a significant impact on privacy and human rights. I think we'd be curious to know, just as a baseline, if there's an emerging framework in China with respect to regulating AI, and if so, whether it appears concerned at all with some of the privacy impacts of AI.
So at this stage, I've been looking with some other colleagues across a number of countries at the various AI strategies and regulatory frameworks. And I think China is similar to a lot of countries in that there's a recognition at the official level and even among companies that there's a need for regulation. But even the basic ideas that are going to feed into whatever that becomes are not fully there yet. Last July, there was this major, very headline-grabbing document out of the Chinese State Council called the New Generation Artificial Intelligence Development Plan. And in this AI development plan, most of what we saw in the newspapers was, okay, by 2030, China is going to lead in AI. And it's sort of, you can sort of translate it as a declaration of intention to lead or a declaration of aspiration to lead. And if you ask some of the drafters of this document, they'll say that, oh, all of these targets will change in a couple of years. You can't project out to 2030 in technology that's moving this fast. But deep down in the document, it's something like 40 pages, you get to these concerns about the social impacts, the policy and ethical impacts, the philosophical things, and it does mention privacy, and it does mention data protection. I wanted to point out, because I'm here, that there's this great new paper from PI in Article 19 on privacy and freedom. This is totally voluntary, I swear. Privacy and freedom of expression in the age of artificial intelligence, and it really lays out some things that countries and companies and researchers should be concerned with and what civil society might want to go after. Something that I think is really interesting here is that this report, coming very much from a democratic perspective, I think, and an international human rights perspective, talks about freedoms of expression and all various types of freedoms that could be violated if privacy is infringed. In the Chinese case, I think the value on privacy is there, but it's just not going to be couched in these freedoms, even if some of them are obligations that the Chinese government has officially signed on to. Just because domestically, if you're going to make an argument about how to avoid harms, if you couch it in international human rights language, it's perhaps less persuasive, or it at least raises flags. So I'm going to be watching. I mean, we're not there yet. We'll see what happens, and there's a lot of discourse to follow. But I'm going to be watching to see how much the international discussion really goes back and forth, but gets translated not just language to language, but into politically tractable things. And then I imagine there will be a tug of war between different forces, people who want to be more sort of regulate more heavily or be more concerned about downsides, or people who want to let the companies reign free so that everyone can make billions of dollars.
So I think we have about 10 minutes left for questions, so I'm going to open it up to the floor now.
Hi, I'm Gus. What's going on with ZTE and Trump, and what's the undercurrent we're just not understanding about the role of national security and links between Chinese companies and the government? And similar question, is there an inverse, is there an equivalent concern within China about US industry that's not just linked to free expression?
Yeah, so this is I mean, it's a tough question because it's evolving very quickly. Over the last week, well, okay, backing up a little bit. For years, the Chinese government, or the US government, has been focused on two Chinese companies in specific as national security risks, Huawei and I say ZTE. But, what are we going to do over here? But you know, in 2012, there was this big report saying these companies are national security risks. The government shouldn't buy them, shouldn't buy their products, and these are sort of network infrastructure products. In the meantime, both companies have become major mobile phone producers and just are huge global companies in the telecom space. That's one track. On another track, ZTE was found to be violating US sanctions on Iran and North Korea by selling its products that contain US origin technology, anyway, in a way that violated the sanctions. Then they got investigated on that track, not this national security risk to America track, but this Iran sanctions thing. They got investigated, and then, yeah, it turned out that they sort of knowingly did this, and then ZTE entered into a settlement agreement with the US government in which they admitted to certain wrongdoing, received an enormous fine, an unprecedented, something like $1.2 billion fine, and then they promised to perform certain actions like disciplining so-and-so and, you know, not going on with these activities. The details are numerous. Then it turns out, according to the US government, ZTE did not comply with that settlement agreement. So that left US law enforcement with the question of how to penalize the company for not adhering to the agreement. And the decision that was taken last month was to essentially ban US companies from selling their products to ZTE, which effectively cut ZTE off from totally non-optional components for all of its major product categories. So effectively, the company was killed. And then, a couple days ago, Donald Trump issued a tweet in which he said that he was working with President Xi of China to address, to make sure that this company doesn't die, claiming that too many jobs in China would be lost, and saying that he had ordered the Secretary of Commerce to get it done. This is extraordinary. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Because just a few days earlier, the Trump administration had pulled out of the Iran deal on the idea that we were going to, as the United States, go back to the sanctions tactic in order to prevent a nuclear and missile program in Iran. So, all right, so that's one message. And then the next message is, well, yeah, but this company that totally disobeyed these sanctions is now getting bailed out for some reason. And then he went on to say that it's actually about US jobs because ZTE is a big customer for the US companies. Nobody knows what's going on. I'm confident that the President of the United States does not understand what's going on in this case. And in this case, he's not alone because, remember, there was the two tracks, right? ZTE, along with Huawei, are very unpopular in the United States, and they're cited as being these big security threats from vague statements about what is said to be known in a classified setting. And then there's this other thing, the sanctions story, which is totally separate. But major members of Congress, Marco Rubio, Adam Schiff, from people from both parties, conflated all of this in their messaging, saying, "Oh, Trump's what a moron! He's, rescuing this company that's a security risk to the United States." And it's like, no, these are two separate stories, and both of them are confusing because in the first one, the public doesn't know why the companies are supposed to be security threats, and in the second one, nobody knows why the president reversed that decision by the Commerce Department. The last thing I'll say about that is I'm not sure the Commerce Department's decision to essentially murder that company for violating sanctions was reasonable. Like, that might not have been a reasonable decision. So reviewing that, or maybe even, pulling it back before it happened, might have been a reasonable policy choice. But to do it in the context of yo, I've been talking to the president of China, and like I'm worried about the jobs over there, so like get it done. I mean, that's nuts. So anyway.
Thanks. So my question is, who outside China can influence China policy making, for example, on some of the issues you mentioned, like let's say the new data protection policy that is coming up? Are there some kind of channels from outsiders to interact with the people inside that are actually discussing these issues?
Thanks. Yeah, it's sort of a yes and no. I mean, there are ways. The first way that the international community affects this process is that the people who write these rules tend to study the international comparisons. So when you meet the people who do these, who develop these regulations, you'll often meet them in a place like Europe or the United States or somewhere else in the world where they're studying what the system is doing there and what's working and what's not. Once something gets drafted and goes into draft form, it's mostly set. But there is some wiggle room for influence when, specifically if the regulations are going to really hurt commerce, major foreign companies or foreign chambers of commerce can have effects around the margins. Unfortunately, I haven't seen, and others can correct me, I'd love to be corrected, I haven't seen much effective civil society or human rights community influence in those frames outside of the sort of, drafting process and people adopting knowledge.
On that penalty, there was an attempt, I think. I mean, that's a completely different. On that penalty, a while ago, there was an attempt by civil society outside and academics to influence the debate within China, trying not to use the international human rights framework, but trying to kind of engage, as you say, with some of these experts that were developing some of the policies. I don't know how effective it was, but there was an attempt to kind of reduce the number of offenses that would carry the death penalty and things like that. But it's also difficult to kind of then translate it into something for another topic.
Right, and so I think there are discussions going on. I'm part of one or two. There are probably 3 or 4 more other discussions that I know about going on between Chinese and international groups on how to deal with AI policy. And since AI doesn't mean anything in specific, and it touches on every area of policy, these can be fairly general discussions until they get drilled down. But I think I'm a person who believes in these types of engagements, both because we learn about each other and because actual useful practical knowledge can be transmitted. And one thing that's clear is that with China as a major developer of AI foundational technology, applications, and deployment, if you want to have global rules or global norms or ethics about AI, it doesn't make any sense without China involved. And you can figure out which actors are the right, are the key points. Is it companies? Is it policymakers? But setting aside 1/5 of humanity and this huge project with major companies and major government investment to develop these technologies would really not work.
Okay, so we're starting to run short on time. I think let's take the last 3 questions. So Tom, Alex, and Millie, and let's take them one at a time now, together, collectively, and then have Graham respond to them.
Hi, I'm Tom Fisher, Research Officer here at PI, and been doing some work on fintech. And while you're right to say there's this dystopian view of China in quite a lot of places, I find in for instance, UK fintech scene, a surprising amount of a utopian view of China because they see the opportunities surrounding the access Chinese fintechs have to payments data, to social graph, all these things, amazing opportunities. But I'm wondering about the kind of investment of Chinese fintechs around the world in markets like India, emerging economies. And does this tie into kind of any of the foreign policy concerns of the Chinese state of spreading their influence in these kind of markets?
Great.
I thought what you initially said on national security being a driver in favour of data protection was really interesting. In Europe, everyone's obsessed with data protection at the moment, but it's much more about the loss of control over your individual data that's generated. So I just wondered, is that the main driver in China, is thinking that all this data being generated actually is a threat to national security, which I wouldn't say is a very strong narrative, at least in the UK or Europe?
Great.
My question, sorry, Alex from Price International. My question is about stakeholder engagement, and you mentioned companies, government, some regulatory bodies as well, and some civil society activities. And so I was just wondering, from what you're doing on China, which stakeholders are missing, basically, from these discourses that you may have seen in other policy areas, but are missing from the AI discourse that could play a role? Thanks.
Okay. These are great questions. I'll take them one by one. With the international investments in fintech, I know it's a major ambition of various Chinese companies to get their platforms taken up outside of China. I don't know, I haven't been tracking closely how that's going, but I know that in many cases, technology companies in China target not the United States, not Europe, but kind of anywhere else first. And as you suggest, this is sort of congruent with this Chinese government rhetoric about the Belt and Road Initiative, which they used to call One Belt, One Road. And it's all very confusing. But the fusion of the official rhetoric of let's build linkages between the Chinese economy and the economies throughout Southeast Asia and Central Asia, and then the ambitions of Chinese companies to sort of build out systems there. I mean, to literally build out the internet. A lot of these the countries that are being targeted for the Belt and Road have very low internet use rates and low connectivity. So if somebody goes and wires up the country, it's probably helpful in a certain sense, but it also puts these Chinese firms in a strategic position, and I think I would expect to see that type of congruence of purpose and then cross-pollination. So yeah, I'll be watching that, and if you are, I'd love to learn more about what you're seeing. Thank you. On national security as a driver of data protection, this idea is also something that really struck me when I came across it. A couple of colleagues and I translated a paper by a colleague of ours in China who noted prominently that, I'm going to get the wording slightly off, I think, but that President Xi in a speech had said that data is an important national resource, or a critical national resource, or a strategic, I can't remember what the modifier was, but it was the notion was that the data itself was a resource for the country, and it was one that was, sort of more important than some other national resources. And then you can, if you take that as a starting point, some of the implications from that paper were that companies like Tencent or Alibaba often have better data, more up-to-date lists of who's doing what where in China than the government does. So if you were going to try to build a whole state surveillance apparatus to keep track of everyone, or if you take the sort of less sinister connotation of surveillance and think about a census, and you want to know who's who's where. You know, these data sets are of value for legitimate governance purposes, right? Presuming you could do it in a way that was ethical and well constructed, it would be valuable. Now we have to deal with the reality of what types of abuses and breaches might occur, but yeah, it's a major part of the viewpoint. And the notion is that if criminals or foreign intelligence services get hold of this data, they might be exploited in various ways. A great example is the breach of the US Office of Personnel Management, which is widely attributed to Chinese intelligence services. This gives, presumably, the Chinese intelligence services a full list, pretty much, of people with security clearances, and then a bunch of personal details about them from the United States. Well, that's handy. That's really good for all sorts of purposes. If a foreign intelligence service could gather that type of information about China, well, that could be handy for them too. So I think I would expect that there's some consciousness of this in a national security discussion in various countries, but it seems more prominent in the Chinese discussion. Maybe because China has benefited from that type of thing. Okay, so the last one, which is conveniently last because it's very hard. Who are the missing stakeholders in the AI discussion? I mean, okay, the easy answer is civil society and sort of like regular people. It's not, at this point in Chinese life, autonomous civil society organizations are very few, and they don't last very long, and they're dangerous to participate in. I guess I mean political ones. I mean, if you want to have the prototypical bowling club or whatever, the state's not going to hammer you down. But as soon as you're talking about something of sort of political substance, or where interests of politics or the market are really at play, it's dangerous to organize because repression has increased. So that means that not only are people not sort of organizing to do it, it means that if sort of well-meaning officials trying to consider all points of view want to go somewhere, they don't have somewhere to go. There are not sort of, people make the comparison with Russia, right? In Russia, you have, by all accounts, an increasingly authoritarian situation under Putin, but you still have people forming opposition, anti-surveillance, internet freedom groups and holding protests in public squares. You don't have this in China. You can't go to those people and try to co-opt them. They're just not organized. So I think that's the sort of big missing link, and I don't know what to do about that other than hope things get better in that sense. Otherwise, I think there's proactive engagement of a lot of stakeholders, for-profit, various types of government, academic experts from everywhere from humanities to technical fields, trade groups. It's really casting a wide net, sort of accept the imagined civic groups from that public sphere that I was so excited about in the early 2000s.
So Graham, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a really illuminating conversation, and we're really grateful to have had you come join us today. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. It's been great.